Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, depending where you are out there in the world. Thank you, everyone, for joining us at Listen and Learn from an Epidemic Outbreak. First and foremost, I wish everyone is safe, home, and I want to extend our apologies for everyone who was attending last week's webinar but couldn't have the chance due to the capacity issue. So we thought we want to make this up to you all, in addition to everyone who wants to join our session today. Some housekeeping rules to start with. Everyone is muted because it is really very hard to have a conversation while having hundreds of attendees joining at the same time. So that's why we choose to make everyone muted. So we are going to have kind of one-way communication, but in order to make it interactive, I want you to keep your questions coming at the chat box. We have a chat box dedicated for questions, and then we do our best to answer these questions towards the end of the session, otherwise offline by sending you your answers as well. So let's kickstart this. My name is Samer Al-Madhoun. I am from Muhakat in Jordan, and I love sharing thoughts and ideas with learners and supply chain professionals like yourself. So thus came this webinar. I thought we used to do these webinars, not webinars actually. We used to do face-to-face free sessions since the last 5 years, but I totally understand the fact that we are all locked up. So I thought this is chance to meet everyone online to talk supply chain. Now, the intention of this webinar, and this is very important, nothing in this presentation intends to create magical stick for your problems during these hard times, okay? Because we know what we are going through all. It's just reflecting on some ideas that I have been thinking lately about observing companies, friends, everyone's post on LinkedIn and social media, interviews, and so on. So I spent some time collecting what can be thought as lessons learned from the epidemic outbreak, actually. So basically, this presentation kind of opening doors for you all to expand. Every single slide has something to expand out with. So take your notes, then Google them, ask me, talk to me, send us emails at Muhakat. We'll be happy to help, actually. Okay. So let's kick this start without further delay. What is the state of the world today? What is the state of the world today as we know it? The global supply chains are still in a shock. No one saw this happening. Supply chains are so independent because supply chains today are a network and we are all connected. We know this for a fact. So because we are connected and our supply chains are becoming complex and complex every day, we have become so fragile. No one saw the COVID outbreak impact happening to us. And most of us are suffering today from the outcomes of that, okay? So I wanna start just hearing back from you on a poll that we prepared at Muhakat. We wanna see how far are the audience disrupted. So I'm gonna launch a poll for you on the screen where you answer with yes or no. Okay, let's prepare the launch. So we are distributing a poll now where we ask you, our supply chains is disrupted as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak. Everyone, please start pushing your answers between yes and no. I thought this would be a great start for our session, understanding the reason behind why are we need to think in a different way going forward in our supply chain. So once we have 100% of answers for the poll and vote, then we'll share that with everyone. That's pretty interesting because we did this exercise last time and kind of getting a feel about the results and definitely understanding why people are joining online webinars on the COVID outbreak, trying to understand what can be done in the future going forward. Okay, still collecting your answers, but we are pretty close. We are pretty close. So We are at 90% voting now. Keep it coming, guys. Keep it coming. Okay. 92% of you are answering. 94 are answering now. I'm sorry it's taking a while because distributing the poll to everyone would take some time, definitely. Good. I think we're good enough with 94% of you voting already. So let me publish the results with everyone. So now in the screen you will see basically there's 93% of you believe that their supply chains in a way or another had been disrupted with the corona outbreak. Actually 7%, you guys are so lucky. 7% of you says no, we were not affected directly or indirectly by the COVID outbreak. Fair enough. Let's go back. Okay. So yeah, this is what I'm talking about. The global supply chains are still in a shock from what happened, and we are so connected and independent on each other that our supply chains became fragile because of the nature of connectivity and dependency we have in our supply chain. Okay, so, and last time I received a question from one of the audience asking us what is really fragile. Fragile is really fragile, just like a glass that's being fragile. Our supply chain are becoming fragile today, subject to complexity and so on. Now, let's examine the world we live at today. Let's examine the world that we live at today. In an article released by in Harvard Business Review last year by Nathan Bennett and Mr. Lamion about the complexity of the world we live at. So they identified what we call it today VUCA. And that's an acronym that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this had been trending actually around supply chain professionals. So I thought I would dedicate some time to talk about this. While everyone is using VUCA naturally to express complexity in a supply chain, but you should understand that there are certain scenarios where you feel the situation is uncertain, maybe not complex or ambiguous, but rather volatile. When you look at the corona outbreak, so basically, if you look at the dimensions here, I have two dimensions. How much do we know about a situation from being low to high versus how well can you predict the results of your actions from low to high? And then you come to think whatever they meet, they form a certain type of risk that your organization would be facing, from ambiguous to uncertain scenarios, complex and volatile scenarios. Thinking of if you take a minute to look at every one of them through the dimensions X, Y, and think of the corona outbreak, you find yourself that the outbreak is some four of them together actually. And this is a rare phenomena where you have that. When we started the very first weeks talking about China and the outbreak of the corona, it was unknown to us. It was ambiguous because we didn't know much about the situation and we didn't know what to expect as a result of our action. So the whole thing was an ambiguous risk to us. Then at a certain point of time, we started to feel that this is very complex. Why? Because we didn't know much about it and we are starting to move to react. Our supply chain is trying to react and we don't know what is going to happen. So that turned to be very complex. And then uncertainty took place where we started to learn about the situation. We started hearing from our suppliers and so on, but we didn't know what to expect. So we know about the situation now, okay? But we don't know what to expect as a result of our actions. So it went uncertain somewhere, and definitely it went volatile somewhere else where we know, but it's very hard for us to expect what is going to happen going forward. So this is really rare where corona becomes VUCA in a world of a supply chain. And that's worth sharing. Maybe sometime you want to Google this article and read more about the complex adaptive system that we need to adopt in our supply chain and how VUCA is affecting our world. So where does that take us? It takes us to facing multiple risks in our organization as part of the VUCA world. Okay. Another great article called The Biology of Corporate Survival, also on Harvard Business Review, talks about how risks are impacting our organizations from a very high level, from a helicopter view. I know very well that most of you are suffering classic risks today, like supply disruption, supplier shutdown, delay on the delivery. I know this, but from a very high helicopter view, we are somewhere facing collapsing risk, what we call it contagion risk, fat tail risk, obsolescence risk. Okay, and this is extremely dangerous because no one is thinking high level today. My advice is that corporate owners, supply chain professionals, managers should think beyond the reactive way of looking at my supply disruption, because the whole business continuity is an issue now. Okay, so let's introduce these risks going forward. Collapse risk, and then you need to think of Corona in relation to these risks actually. Collapse risk, where change from within or outside the industry renders the firm business model obsolete. So what is happening today is changing the whole customer perspective, bringing to what we call it today the new normal. The world will not be today as it will be in the future. So going forward, the whole business model that you are operating might be obsolete. So this is where you face collapse risk as part of Corona outcomes. Contagion risk, where a shock in one part of the economy or business ecosystem, and this is what is happening today, spread rapidly to other parts, and this is the domino effect that we are living in the industries and our supply chains today because of our connectivity in supply chain. Now, fat tail risk, keep thinking of Corona, guys. Rare but large shocks, such as natural disaster, terrorism, epidemics, political turmoils, and so on. And that's basically what Corona is all about, fat tail risk. Obsolescence risk, the firm fails to adapt to changing needs. It could be like, for example, customer needs as part of the Corona effect, or competitive innovations, or circumstances that we live at, and so on. So the whole business model is an obsolescence risk. Okay. This also applies to everything that happened in Corona today. That's why we need to learn. As I said, there's no magical stick here. We will keep fighting. Our corporates should keep fighting, but at the bottom line, we need to learn something from the future. So this is the state of the world today as we know it. And then what should every supply chain professional learn going forward, after we overcome the Corona impacts? The greatest lesson today is there is a need for a robust risk management approach in the organization for our supply chain, for our supply chains actually, because knowing companies around the Middle East and worldwide, not everyone has a robust system of risk management running in the organization for the supply chain. We need to get the risk management approach within the DNA of the organization. So I'm going to pull again, but this time different pull, on asking you all if you have a clear, robust risk management approach for your supply chain implemented in your organizations. And as simple as yes, no, please. So let's distribute the poll, and we're gonna enjoy the showing the answers together as well. Between yes and no, where do we go? Very promising, because I see some companies saying that they do, and that's really great. By a robust risk management approach, we mean you guys identify the risks in your supply chain. You have a risk register in place where you keep updating for your risks. You meet to discuss, formal meetings to discuss the risks in the organization on your supply chain, thinking of handling strategies for those risks. This is what we call it, a robust risk management approach for the supply chain. Okay, and I'm not here talking about the company in general. I'm talking about the supply chain, because we know for a fact that companies has audit today, financial risk management sometimes, auditors that highlights any issues in the process and so on. We know this for a fact that the majority of companies had this inherent today as part of the governance approach for the organization. So thinking supply chain, because this is what we are all about, We're trying to figure out how much do we have from a risk management approach in the organization. Okay, so now we have roughly 86% of you answering. And pretty interesting, because last time we ran the poll over hundreds and hundreds of the attendees, and the results went into one proper direction. And still, I think we have the same direction going on today, where the majority of you believe that they do not have a robust management approach. If you do have, I would love if you share your thoughts one day about it, if you get in touch with us to tell us or share your experience, and I would include the good experiences that you have within the presentation slides in the future. Okay, so we do have 90% of you already on the poll, so let's close that poll and publish. Fair enough. Sharing the results, 90% of you voted, saying that 69% of you, your companies, believe that your company does not have a robust risk management approach in the organization for supply chain, while 30% of you say we do have a robust risk management approach. However, regardless you belong to the sample of 69 or 31, I know for a fact that the outbreak took everyone by surprise. Took everyone, regardless what you have, I know. But the impact that you are living today would be less if you have a robust risk management approach rather than not having one. Okay, so that's what we are talking about. Interesting. So what do you mean by having a robust risk management approach for supply chain? This is adapted from ISO 31000, a risk management approach. You have to leverage on tools and techniques for managing risks. Okay, I don't care where you get that from. You read about it, you bring a consultant, you establish something internal, probably using something other than ISO 31000, whatever. You need to have a robust process like establishing the context of risk management in the organization, identifying risk events that you might be facing, evaluating those risks, quantifying those risks, risk handling strategies. And if you ever been to a supply chain class like CCP or CLTD or CPIM, I'm sure you would have seen this more or less. Okay, and this is what we need to practice today. I know some of you account for the risk from a supply chain perspective, but this is more of an informal process where they think, what is going to happen if the supplier is late? Let me add safety stock and so on. We know this is happening among supply chain professionals. Supply chain professionals are well educated about that, but the fact that you don't have a proper risk management approach is a risk by itself. Okay, so let's talk about establishing the context of risk management. My first advice to you, I'm going to just skim fast over these elements. My greatest advice to do is you start doing that by assessing your supply chain vulnerability today. How vulnerable is my supply chain? And in order to do that, I know that there is a lot of free models that you can use today, like questionnaire models, to assess your vulnerability in the supply chain. PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, has a great one available for free, where you submit questions, yes, no, and then you receive a consolidated report on how vulnerable is your supply chain. Here is an example of another one that comes from CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, and it's available for free, by the way. Okay, there's no hidden investment here. You get to answer questions like legal, environmental, structural, sourcing questions, and so on. Yes, no, unsure, yes, no, unsure. Then the system, the engine will compile for you a whole report that tells you how vulnerable is your supply chain. Okay, so why don't you go steps.org and check on the supply chain vulnerability exercise and try to figure out in which part of your supply chain you are vulnerable the most and what needs to be done to safeguard your supply chain going forward, because we cannot let this happen to us again, being taken by surprise by the risks out there. Okay, remember, it's a VUCA world today that we live at, which means, is it possible that this would take place again in a different manner? Of course. Okay, so better be prepared. Identifying risks, we know this for a fact happens in a different way, multiple ways where you can create SWOT analysis or brainstorm about it. But one great way to identify risks is that you visualize your supply chain. While this looks like an easy exercise, but the outcomes of this exercise are exceptionally helpful in risk management, where you try plot a physical map and draw the links between the nodes of your supply chain. And one great pitfall that you would have here is that you only link and visualize your first tier suppliers. And that's a mistake. You should go beyond first tier suppliers and first tier customers as much as you want, as much as it takes, or how complex you want to see your supply chain. Because I had a very interesting chat with a supply chain manager in Saudi Arabia. He said, we are secured from the outbreak outcomes because none of our suppliers is in China, and that just brought it to my mind. Yeah, there might be that the first tier of suppliers that you have is not in China, but it's very likely that the second tier of suppliers, where your suppliers are dependent on, comes from China, and it's a matter of time where your supplier will run out of stock because his supplier or their suppliers are in China, or probably the third tier of suppliers is in China. That's why you need to figure out, and this is what we call it visibility in the supply chain. You try to plot, and you don't want to have a software for that. This is Google exercise. You can do this through Google, as you can see from this. There are professional softwares to do that, but start with a simple Google exercise where you draw the links between your warehouses, your network, your warehouses, your factories, distribution centers, where is the material coming from, and so on. And that would give you a great insight in your supply chain, where you highlight, you say, this area is where the risk is coming from, and there has to be something done. Or probably somewhere here, or an epidemic is taking place here, or fruit disease is taking place here, and you start identifying risks around the physical places that you have in your supply chain. That's a great exercise where you say, I want to visualize what is happening on my supply chain. Okay, so now we established a risk context, then we try to identify multiple risks. It's very important for you to evaluate those risks, because some of these risks might be severe, some of them might be easy to deal with or negligible if you want, and so on. That's why you need to evaluate every single risk that you have, and the evaluation will take form of how much will I pay if this risk really happen, how much I am going to pay to prevent this risk from happening. So this is where you evaluate the risk, because at the bottom line of this, you want to make sure that you handle, say we once ran an exercise, by the way. We had 55 risks in one place, potential risks in one place, but it is really impossible to deal with 55 risks at once. So we wanted to prioritize the risks. We looked into 2080 exercise, and we did evaluate all the risks. Then the exercise was, which risks are more important than others, where I want to take more actions or focus on them. Okay, so that's why you need to evaluate every single risk, because some risks are class A, some risks are class B, some risks are class C. Some risks might lead to collapse as an outcome, or obsolescence as an outcome. Some of these situations are uncertain or complex, so you need to kind of evaluate and classify every one of these risks, because the bottom line to this is that you want to come out with a solution to mitigate the impact of these risks in your organization. So you run the quantification exercise in this case, and then, as I said, quantifying is about the impact that you would have in a dollar sign value. Then you would ask yourself, what needs to be done to handle these risks? Okay, and there are the same article, the Biology of Corporate Survival, talks about different types of risks and how are we going to deal with them. For example, you would create for a fat tail risk, which is basically rare but large shocks such as natural disasters, etc., epidemics, and so on. One great way, one proper strategy to deal with that is the redundancy. The redundancy stands for your ability to have multiple suppliers in place instead of a single source or a sole source of supplies. Okay, building a supplier database, for example, would have been a great rescue for you in the current situation. Okay, I know it's not as easy as said, but some companies were resilient enough, and 2 lines under resilient enough to reduce the impact of the corona outbreak by having a redundant supplier bases somewhere outside China. Okay, so a different way to deal with things, like basically modularity of products, prioritizing products, which one you want to produce more or less, thinking of the demand prioritization and supply prioritization. You have to have your exercise, so whenever these shocks comes to your supply chain, you are better prepared than someone that's taken totally by surprise from these risks. Okay, and it would take us 3-4 hours to think of the risk mitigation strategies, but the bottom line here is that you need to think of a different way to deal with those risks, and having a risk register where you put all these risks in place. Now, another great ISO that I had the pleasure of implementing in one of the organizations, that would be the supply chain continuity thinking. Okay, regardless of the amount of risk, and this is really evolving from risk management, regardless of the amount of risks you would have in your supply chain, okay, it should not let your supply chain down 100%. You should have a minimal capacity of operating, and this is what we call it supply chain continuity management. Another great ISO 22301 that allows you, or whatever you want to use, it's good. But definitely, I'm copying from ISO because ISO is a best practice, where this ISO or whatever similar to it will help your organization to become better prepared for significant disruptions. So when the disruption would come, you will always have a plan B. Okay, I always tell my learners about Maersk's ability to come back after the cyber attack they had, or other companies that would come back from a major disruption, because they had this continuity planning in the DNA of the organization. Continuity planning entails how do we communicate during crisis. Me, my supplier, my distributor, everyone. How are we able to communicate effectively in the age of crisis? Is my supply chain designed to manage risk? When I design my network, my IT infrastructure, when I design my supplier base, where I hold my material and so on, do I have embedded in this design what can make me resilient? Okay, do I have a plan B in the design itself? Just like the IT guys, they always have to have backup, backup for disaster recovery, in which they, whenever a crash would take place on the database, they would be able to come back with an alternative database, which is a backup, and they mirror the data. I know this because I come from the technology background. In the aviation system, IATA requests all major airlines around there to have an alternative route for their trips. So one route is closed. Once one of your routes is closed, you will immediately have an alternative route how to reach by plane to the same place and same destination. This is what we call it supply chain design to manage risk. So going forward, when you have suppliers or you want to secure suppliers or do the sourcing process, it's very important to think of multiple sources of supply. Call it supplier plan B, call it whatever, alternative supplier, and so on. I've seen many companies trying to do 50% or 75% sourcing from one supplier in China, 25% sourcing from another supplier with similar quality in Mexico, for example. The attempt here is that to keep your supply chain running, if something happened to the supplier in China, for example, you still have 25% of your capacity coming from somewhere else. And this is where you want to work harder to increase the 25%. That's what we call risk management exercises in the organization. And I think this had been missing totally from the discipline of supply chain and what supply chain professionals do every day. They are busy with reactive activities. I know this. I had been there. Most of you, right? They just do release the PO, receive the material, supply planning, and so on. But in a higher level, we have to design a supply chain that's able to manage risks. So if anything would happen, we are better prepared than other organizations. Okay, and this is what we call it the survival in the new normal. So what is happening today is the new normal going forward, and we better get used to that by creating a resilient supply chains. Now, I know for a fact that we cannot enhance what we can't measure. That's why your risk management approach needs to have kind of KPIs to measure that performance. So from a supply chain perspective, you plan and you source. Then once you source, if you are manufacturing, you make, and then you deliver finished products, and there's a chance that you would return those products to your customers. One of the great lessons learned from the outbreak today is that you need to keep measuring your supply chain risk values. Okay, so once, going back to the exercise of risk management, once you identify those risks, and we talked about quantifying those risks, you have to quantify all the risks associated with the sourcing process, all the risks associated with delivering. So you have this list of risks, and if any of these risks happens, how much I am going to lose money. So you need to quantify based on dollar value how much is risk embedded in every one of these processes. Okay, how much risk is embedded in the making process that we have. So you would identify a machine breakdown in the making process. You need to attempt to quantify that from a dollar sign. And then if you have a loss of supplier, loss of a sole supplier, or a supplier going out of market, how much am I going to lose as a consequence of that? Okay, poor planning and poor forecasting, how much I'm going to lose out of that, making returning process and customer dissatisfaction, and so on. Then you have to sum up all the values of these risks by calculating value at risk, what we call it VAR today, which is basically fairly straightforward. VAR of planning, VAR of sourcing, VAR of making, VAR of delivering and returning wherever applicable. And then you would come back, let's say you come back and say, the value at risk of my supply chain is $1 million. What is that supposed to mean? That I'm operating a supply chain, but at any point of time, if all these risks happen, I might lose $1 million, depending on your calculations accuracy and so on. Okay, and that would be a great starting figure to see, wow, my supply chain is under great risk. Definitely, the lower the VAR, the better the status of the organization and the better their ability to act very fast. The higher the VAR, it means you will get stuck in a way or another in the process, and that's why you need to find alternative ways of doing things or risk management strategies and so on. Okay, so that's one great measure that everyone should Google further and try to attempt to calculate that within the organization boundaries, especially for their supply chains. Actually, one great measure also that you need to always keep an eye on is time to recover. And time to recover is literally time to recover. How much time it takes you to come back from a certain risk. So let's say we have a machine breakdown or a fleet breakdown. Okay, time to recover as a KPI is how much time it takes you until you recover from that machine breakdown, going back to normal operations. Okay, so there's no magic in the formula here, but you need to account for the supplier delay time or the customer delay time and so on, and say all these come together as the time needed to recover from my disaster. So that's another great measure that you need to keep an eye on. One great lesson that I also learned is to establish a resilient contracting process. Today, everyone is talking about force majeure today. Force majeure is the act where you think that this contract is not valid anymore. Okay, and let me highlight this clear. I'm an arbitrator, and I worked recently in one of the contracts where between a government and a supplier of cars, a European supplier of cars, and the government is suing the car manufacturer for not delivering on time for the vehicles to be used in a police station, and we were arbitrating, is that force majeure? Actually, in that very case, it was not a force majeure, because it depends on the law and regulations taken under the contract, and usually force majeure historically did not include epidemics, and still does not include epidemics actually in the British law, for example. But I would call that contract frustration. And contract frustration means that we have reached a stage in a contract where this contract is not applicable anymore. So no one has to file anything. The whole contract is not valid, and no one is in a legitimate delivery to the other party or any type of commitment. While force majeure is because excusable delay is not in the contract between the parties, but it creates an excusable delay for not delivering between you and your suppliers. Okay, so that's worth mentioning. You need to tighten up your contracts and that's part of your risk management to understand when does a force majeure takes place. And by the way, force majeure has its literature where companies has to file force majeure to غرف تجارية and so on, and commercial entities to say we are unable to continue due to this and that, and then they will have to see the regulations, the law that's governing the contract, if this force majeure or not. So don't think of anything happening as a risk as a force majeure. Actually, even if it's extreme, you have to identify exactly what kind of risk is that, and according to that to see if this is really force majeure or just contract frustration from a procurement standpoint, actually, and a legal standpoint. Always great to establish an exit strategy from the contract, where if this contract is not, or the contractor or the supplier is not able to perform anymore, you find a proper way to leave that contract. And that would be an exit clauses or termination clauses and so on. So that's worth mentioning. I see some of you are raising hands. As I said, unfortunately, due to the number of attendees, it will be very hard to take discussions here, but you can always leave your notes and your questions on the box, and we will have a look at them towards the end of the class. Okay, how is your technology doing in these hard times? You know, one great lesson that we also leave with after the corona impact is how resilient is my technology. I know all of us has ERP systems. I know we're trying to communicate digitally today, but really there's a whole discipline about digitalizing my supply chain today. Okay, and the world every supply chain should think of the future going forward, that the importance of digitalizing an entire supply chain, partially or fully, is something very important. Okay, so I want to introduce to you the digital capability model. Deloitte, the consulting company, along with Apex, the Association of Supply Chain Management, have done an extraordinary exercise on what does it look like to have a digitalizing capability model in the supply chain. And they identified, as you see, 6 pillars that, if implemented in the supply chain technology, I know this sounds like a rocket science to you, but this is how the supply chain of the future will look like. Okay, being able to sense, predict, optimize, and collaborate with supply chain partners, and one of which is sensing and adapting and predicting of what can be done or what is going to be done in the cases of risk management, just like Corona, for example, and the outbreak. Okay, and they identified what we call it dynamic fulfillment, digital development, intelligent supply, smart operations, and so on. If you are an Apex member, I invite you to go to ASCM website and have a look at the digital capability model, DCM, and then you can maneuver around the DCM to see the exact context. Sorry, I'm having an error here. To see the context of digital capability. So let me try to explore it from the website itself. Digital capability model for supply networks. And a very, very interesting model for supply chain professionals to look at. This is how the supply chain of the future will look like going forward, and companies should consider thinking of synchronized planning, supply network designs, dynamic optimization, and so on, or probably smart operations, total operation synchronization, digital process twin. I'm going to spend some time talking about the digital process twin. So if you click on the digital twin, and I'm going to identify this to you shortly, a digital twin, let me identify that. Okay. A digital twin is basically your supply chain mimicked in a virtual format. All the activities that you do, your supply chain setup, physical setup, information setup, suppliers, are all mimicked or have a virtual format, and that virtual format would be your twin. And then you will test every incident that you have, every decision that you want to make on the twin, digital twin, to see the impact of that. So reducing number of orders per day, losing that supplier, and so on. And the digital twin will live this incident inside of you and simulate this incident to you and come back and say, this is how much your supply chain will suffer as a result of the outbreak of corona, for example. Imagine if you have that prior to any activity that you undertake, major activity, where your supply chain is being digitally simulated, and you see the results immediately in your supply chain. So this is what we call it digital twins. And in relation to your supply chain, so if we break down the digital twin as C, it will have aspects everywhere, okay? Somewhere it relates to the supply network design, meaning the digital twin will be able to accommodate your supply and procurement design, or will give you monitor and insights on the supply chain. Many aspects actually, products tracking, intelligent product tracking in the supply chain, and this is a very huge model. We will not have time to explain it, but my advice to you is that you go to the corner and then assess your digital readiness in the supply chain. You click on assess the digital readiness to understand how much your supply chain have in terms of digitalization in the supply chain. Then and that's also free, by the way, huh? And then that would come back to you in a great report that tells you how far do you go in connectivity with customers, smart operations, intelligent supplies, and so on. So you would have a PDF file sent to your email totally for free, actually, to assess, when you answer these questions, to assess how far are you from digitalizing your supply chain. And now everyone, after I put these slides, I started to see everyone talking about digitalizing your supply chain as an outcome of the corona impact, actually. So keep an eye on these and try them, since they are for free. Try them, and it would be interesting to think of the supply chain of the future in your organization. How does it look like? Okay. Now, to sum up some great ideas of what is going to happen in the future now, how supply chain professionals are going to think, how companies are going to behave going forward, because they learned the lesson in a hard way. Okay. The biggest thing that will happen going forward is probably considering cost versus resilience. We all source from cheap sources today because this is our attempt to reduce cost. We know this for a fact, and our desire to reduce cost. But going forward, companies will consider resilience, saying, I'm going to pay more, but my supply chain will be less disrupted. So I would rather manufacture in Germany, or manufacture in my hometown, or or move my supply chain from China to somewhere else. Okay, so there will be thoughts on sacrificing resilience for cost going forward. Okay, saying we might wish to increase the cost, but that will compensate on the resilience of the supply chain. And companies started to think of that going forward, actually. Thinking offshoring versus inshoring. Of course, this is clear. Huh? Everyone had been offshoring and manufacturing in Vietnam, China, Indonesia, and so on, Mexico. But now companies will think of inshoring and bringing back the operations to their hometowns as an option. Okay, because the total cost of ownership of the offshoring decision they made is becoming huge now, and might be as much as equal to the inshoring process. I'm sure Trump will be, if he's attending today, I'm not sure if it's Trump attending with us, he would be happy with offshoring versus inshoring because this is the make America great again is all about, actually. Anyway. I'm not a Trumpist, but we're just sharing thoughts on that. Companies will think of inshoring, and I've started seeing companies and countries, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has went so far with this by 3 years ago, part of the Vision of 2030, attempting to localize the contents, partially or fully localize the content, which means empowering local suppliers in the economy. So we would rely on them on supplying our material, regardless if it's first tier or second tier or whatever. Okay, Jordan's trying to think of electrified dhati, or making everything from the inside, and so on. So countries are starting to think offshoring versus inshoring, and there will be great considerations going forward, probably not now, next year or so on companies going back to their home, yeah, to fulfill their supplies and so on. Among the trends in the future, thinking variety of products versus availability. So now you are producing, you have an SKU, you are producing or distributing or managing like 100 products. Okay, think of the toothpaste from Colgate or other companies. the amazing variety that they have today by sizes, by flavors, therapeutical versus kids, and so on. I think this is one of the reasons why complexity is inherent in our supply chain, because the amazing variety of the products that we intend to sell to satisfy the customers. And that's a discipline in the supply chain, in the CRM thinking, creating diversity for different segments in the supply chain and so on. Companies will start thinking of the future, saying, okay, instead of having 100 SKUs in place, why don't we have 10 SKUs and assure their availability much, much better than having 100 SKUs in a complex supply chain where we are unable to manage them due to the complexity of supplies and the VUCA world we live at. So there might be a great chance that companies reconsider the number of SKUs that they are trading, okay? Modularizing contents together and jamming products together and reducing flavors maybe, I don't know, okay? But this is something that had been trending today in the media, actually. Now, we are the heroes in this situation. I know you had been reading about this and hearing about that. Actually, who is managing today is basically supply chain professionals. I had been talking to my friends from different places around the world that works in supply chain. In Jordan, outside Jordan, from Carrefour, from medical companies, they are on duty full days, actually, okay? That's because we are trying to manage the disruption that's happening in our supply chain. So us as supply chain professionals, we have to be better prepared. We have to be better educated. So there are great sources out there in the market, reading books about supply chain risk and mitigation strategies and so on. These are the great books that I personally recommend, but there are hundreds outside that you can download or buy or whatever. The Demand-Driven Adaptive Enterprise is an amazing book that talks about the VUCA world we live at, as you see, surviving and adapting in a VUCA world. Okay, this is a great book by Gregory, also Supply Chain Risk Management, and this is definitely my book of choice, The Power of Resilience, how companies are managing the unexpected that we live at. So you read about great case studies from tsunami and so on, and how companies were disrupted and so on. So educate yourself. I have attached a handout for you in the presentation here. So if you are able to download it, it's from SEPS as well. There are great resources to read out there. SEPS, Apex, other organizations, PwC, Deloitte, Gartner, they have amazing resources to talk about immediately what can you do in your supply chain, how to visualize your supply chain, how to map your supply chain, and so on. Okay? Get great educations out there. The more you educate yourself about the discipline of supply chain, the more you are able to enhance the current situation and manage it in a better format. There's a great difference between someone that's well educated in procurement using practices like SIPS practices and SIPS standards of sourcing, other than those who doesn't do. So educate yourself, do self-study, go to classes, whatever, join online, do whatever it takes, try to educate yourself in great certification that spans over the entire supply. CLTD, CPIM, SCORE, CSCP are all great educations for you to great resources to benefit from as in the sense of best practices in your supply chain. Okay. Now, whatever you think we can help you in advice, and that's totally as part of the activity that we do in supply chain. You are always welcome to send us questions at info@muhakat.com or text us directly on our WhatsApp, and we do our best to answer your questions, actually. Okay, so I have like 5 minutes, 10 minutes to talk about question and answer. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming. We'll do my best to tackle as much as we can of them. Mayar is asking, I'm not sure if I'm saying the name right, but Mayar is asking, what skills will be required by supply chain professionals in the upcoming days? Good question, Mayar. Definitely the ability to recognize risks, identify them, and thinking of a different way of doing things. Risk management as a great skill, Mayar, is something to look at in the future of supply chain professionals. Having an analytical capability as well to calculate VAR, for example, or to think of the impacts that we have in the future is something to consider in the supply chain of the professional. So going forward, if I want to hire someone, I will make sure to ask him, how do you manage supply chain risks? So please educate yourself on that as well, okay? How do I access this slide? Niraj is asking. Probably you will be able to see a whole recording of this material will be sent to your email directly, okay? Muhammad is asking, how can we determine the weakness and risks in our supply chain? That's what's basically the risk management exercise, Muhammad, that I'm talking about. You need to brainstorm together, visualize your supply chain, think of the potential risks that would happen, draw a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, okay? And that's, Muhammad, very important question, because this is what is really risk management is about. This is what we mean by having a robust risk management exercise, okay? Niraj is asking again, how critical is SCORE model in such pandemic times? You know, Niraj, I would say it's the best thing that can be used to restructure your supply chain today. The best thing that can be used to restructure your supply chain today in a resilient one is using the SCORE model. Okay, more questions coming. Excuse me if I don't read all the questions, I'm doing my best. Khaldoon is saying, by default, any figure or analysis related to supply chain transaction during COVID outbreak will be an odd. Yes, I agree with you. So how to avoid any negative impacts of such odds on our forecast decision in the future? You know, my greatest advice to you today is to increase the visibility of the supply chain and to use automated softwares today. There are great softwares and they're not very expensive, where you can deploy on monthly subscriptions, for example, where you can use them to analytically understand the demand going forward. And yes, I agree with you that all the numbers will be odd because things are different going forward. We need to build our database for future events. Muhammad Tib is asking, do you think that one of the future solutions for such crisis in the future is onshoring in the supply chain? Yes, big time, Muhammad. As I said, probably this question came through while I was talking. Onshoring will be a trend going forward. Countries will start considering strategically that the globalization will not be the solution anymore because it made us fragile, as I said. So companies will start thinking of coming back in-house and doing onshoring as a result of the outbreak. Okay. The problem with the current crisis is the restrictions on material and people movement. Even if you need technical staff, you will definitely have problems. Can you elaborate? Yeah, Muhammad, I think, as I said, we are all caught in this scenario, and we need to do our best to live with the lowest minimum cost of disruption, okay? One colleague of mine is based in Lebanon, and out of curiosity, she's a great supply chain professional. Out of curiosity, I was asking her, how do you guys are managing your factory? She said, we haven't stopped meeting to discuss what products needs to be prioritized, what products can be sold online, what products we need to manufacture, and so on. And they do have restriction of resources as well, you know, but you want to try your best to leave these crises with the minimal cost of disruption. And that's the difference between someone that's kind of prepared with risk management approach and continuity planning and others that does not have that, okay? Can you shed some light on the behaviors of some companies? They have complete shutdown, man. There's no behaviors. The companies that's more resilient, Muhammad, are the ones that probably didn't see this happening, but at least had an alternative source of supply, okay? Where the change of the production, I know for a fact that Samsung managed to shut down an entire factory in Vietnam and operate it somewhere else on 50% of its capacity today, okay? Apple were able to launch a new mobile. Imagine, amid crisis, they managed to launch a new. That's the resiliency that we are talking about. Okay. Elias is asking, we paint manufacturing company, we have stock tight space and we cannot keep safety stock, and the main chemical suppliers are ones who lead the market and can change the delivery schedule at any point. Yeah, so you're having a sole supplier in this case. They only update us with the new delivery date. This is highly affecting our schedule, noting that we don't have any alternative suppliers. The question is, why do we don't have alternative suppliers? Is it the only sole suppliers out there in the world? Was this exercise done before Bilal, attempting to find alternative source suppliers? Now, if it's the only source of suppliers out there, yeah, that's a risk by itself, away from Corona, actually, just like Sabic and other great companies out there where they kind of manipulate create a monopoly market, actually. Mobilize team, okay. Muhammad Tib is asking, some solutions are to check our current suppliers' capability of producing other material to cover the supplier who are failing. Of course, yeah. I think supply chain financing is the most companies are complete shutdown. You know, it's a hard time. As I said, we don't have magical stick for this, but we need to keep managing in a reactive format. So basically, yeah, you can check with current suppliers if they are able to manufacture something else instead. You know, I have seen many companies trying to act in a different way. I have seen two companies collaborating to produce different products alternatively, or meeting up to produce a new product for the market. You know, collaboration might be a great key in this sense. Okay, supply chain financing, most companies are in complete shutdown. The fixed costs are still running. Yeah, unfortunately, Muhammad, this is happening because no one saw this happening. But as I said, some companies are reducing the impact than others. Today, we live the extremist form of risk management out there. Extremist form, the VUCA coming all together. Tahir is asking, what would be the best action once we have some suppliers holding some order due to credit limitation and our management want to keep as much as cash? You know, this is Tahir is a cash management problem because companies are relying on credit management. Tahir, one great way to do this is called supply chain finance, and supply chain finance is where banks comes in the middle to finance everyone in the supply chain. Okay, and then no one would have to have credit hold against each other, and the bank would benefit from having royalty everywhere in the processes that they do. And this is established in Jordan, by the way. Pharmacy One in Jordan has supply chain financing. Aramco has supply chain financing programs with the banks and so on. Bank Al-Ittihad in Jordan has a supply chain finance program where they finance the entire supply chain, receivables, payables, manufacturers, everyone. That's a great instrument today for the credit issues and so on. Osama is asking about force majeure and the closure of road by civil or military authorities are conditioned beyond the control. Yeah, I agree. That creates an excusable delay between parties, as I said, but not contract frustration. If such an event occurs, then both parties will work together to find amicable solution. I agree with you, Osama, and that's sometimes beyond the hand of the companies, actually. Great questions, guys. Force majeure is a worldwide definition. Yeah, I agree with you. Natural disasters, earthquake, road eruption, work strike, earthquake. I don't see epidemics, Osama, on the definition that you have. And that's what I'm trying to highlight to everyone. It depends on the laws and regulations of the contract, والمشرعين, on what is really considered a force majeure. What is really considered a force majeure. Hamza is asking, what information were needed to lessen the uncertainty? The more you create visibility in the supply chain, the more your supply chain is able to adapt. Please go to the digital capability model, Hamza, and try to read through. It's amazing to create a digital environment that senses and adapts. You may say, oh, this might be overwhelming exercise for my company, or this is too much of a technology to me. Well, the alternative is living the current situation. Okay, so I have to balance between how can I sense and adapt in the future. In the smallest form is creating visibility between you and your suppliers, which is very complex as well. Okay. Mayar Majd, I'm sorry you lost some contact. I think Tahir, how to digital some part of the supply chain department. I get your point on digitalizing supply chain department while being on the field. Yeah, this is a whole company exercise, Tahir, not only yourself, where the entire company wants to come to digitalizing sense, and this depends how mature is your supply chain in the organization and how much fund you have, and so we know this. Okay, the majority of companies in Jordan are somehow is a multiple dysfunction companies where they don't have digitalization in the supply chain. Fahad is asking how airlines companies would mitigate the risk while most flights are shut down. Yeah, by the way, Fahad, the greatest risk takers today are as an outcome of the outbreak are airlines. I was talking in general when something happened like war in Syria, for example. The airlines would have an alternative route to reach to a different destination. But I get your point. Yeah, this is not applicable to what I'm saying. I mean, the whole, yeah, they are in shutdown actually. They wouldn't treat this issue. They're just waiting, you know. And this is, I was talking to someone from Royal Jordan where they said this is the most catastrophic event happening today to the airlines industry. George is asking, the current situation will definitely lead to production and supply bottlenecks after business resumes. What are your recommendations to counter that? As I said, building a resilient supply chain, considering less complex variability of products, alternative sources of supplies, doing things in-house as much as possible, and so on. This is what comes to my mind, George, when you talk about the impacts, actually. What about supply chain finance? We talked about that, definitely. Okay. Yasser is asking how these methods, techniques, and tools we witnessed during your session can be adapted to a supply chain services model in similar format. Yasser, it doesn't differ wherever a product or service. We are after sensing and predicting the future of our capabilities, internal and external, Yasser. So I wouldn't believe that the digital capability model applies only for products. Even the score model applies for products and services. Even the digital twin softwares today, they apply for services and for products. You know, most of the slides talks about the supply chain when it comes and they have tangible products. Yeah, I get your point because the majority of supply chains apply that. But however, Yasser, get in touch with me because the digital capability model is still applicable for services industry, actually. Okay. Lias Khouri, can you tell us who is the supply chain professional in Lebanon? No, I would respect the privacy for that. But maybe if she wants to get in touch with you, she can. Okay. What do you think about the compound of resilience of the supply chain? Please enjoy. Kim, can you please elaborate more on what you mean by the compound? Resiliency is about the ability to respond faster than others to the changing needs of customers and suppliers. So what we need to build today is what we call it resiliency. Your ability to shift to alternative sources. If you don't have it, that doesn't mean it means just you are not resilient, okay? So I think one great lesson is that we need to think in the future, how do we create resiliency in the supply chain? I highly recommend NGO that you look into the SCORE model to show you around what processes can be done to create resiliency. I'm doing my best to answer in a short format because to accommodate many questions. Osama, from COVID-19 epidemic, we learned that many of businesses and learning become distance learning and digitalized. So the lessons learned from the risk management is how the world turned to digital. Yeah, I totally agree with you. So not only from an education perspective, do you think that we have to think of that way? Yeah, of course. When we talk about the digital capability model and the digital twin and digitalizing the supply chain, still the physical flow will be there, but the information flow will enhance to make me more resilient. So yeah, I believe that many businesses now are forced to go e-commerce, for example, to Uberize their business on the deliveries and so on. And we're living if you are in Jordan, we're kind of living this in Jordan. A friend of mine is making fortunes today because he's helping companies building e-commerce web stores for them and so on. So e-commerce, I would add this to the trends going forward. E-commerce in the Middle East increasing in general. That's another question not relevant to our session. How much time in terms of hours per day in total do I need to self-study the CSCP? I'm gonna take this offline, Yasser, and answer you later on. Muhammad Shahde, what is the improvement after Corona expected to apply in supply chain management? Building a resilient supply chain, building a supply chain that's able to adapt faster, understanding let my supply chain be more visible, and let me understand the risks further in my supply chain. Elias is asking, what about shipping and transportation during the global crisis? We have seen great effects, Elias, on the I was talking to someone from Aqaba Container Terminal yesterday. There are great losses associated with shipping. There are some halt in ports as well, but it's coming back gradually, Elias. We will need some time to adapt and come back gradually. What is the impact of cash flow on supply chain in the current situation? Catastrophic, Hazem, by its nature, because companies are delaying. As long as you don't have income, you try to delay your payments to the suppliers, and if you don't have receivables, you would try to balance that with your payables, and you have your money stuck in the inventory. So the cash flow is, you know what I think, Hazem, honestly, this is developing to become, from an economical perspective, this is developing to become, what do you call it, recession. But swift recovery is accepted, but now we will live a recession as an outcome of Corona impacts. Yusuf is asking, how can we maintain the company's profit in light of changing petrochemical prices? That's another great risk that companies should be accounted for, and it's like a hidden agenda today where oil prices went down to like $20 per barrel. It's very hard to predict, Yusuf. This is one of the great risks that some companies are shifting. You know, it sounds crazy, but some companies are shifting to green technologies to stop relying on the whole petrochemical industries, actually. You know, the airlines are doing great job. Yes, Noor, but not in the current situation because they are in halt, actually. Rowan is asking, have we faced such pandemic before? Yeah, of course we did, Rowan, but not in the very recent years. Back then there were no supply chain at all, but historically the world lived lots of pandemics, actually. Okay, your name given, Tahir. My name is Samir. Thank you. Noor is asking, how can automotive dealership should react? I think the whole world today is in a mess, you know. But I think what they should think in the future is, where do I want to manufacture? Where do I want to ship my products from? Okay. We need to act fast, especially for medication and patients. Yeah, when it comes to patients' life, I think there's a great risk of losing patients. So if you work in a medical field, going forward, resiliency is the name of the game, actually, where you want to adapt faster to the changing needs of the markets and supplies and so on. Okay, I think we are done, and I see more questions coming. I'm sorry I cannot adapt to all these questions, but I'll make sure to answer them and add them to a PDF file and email that to you all. I want to thank you very much. I just want to say one thing. Great education coming your way. Whenever you have time, check SEP's diploma in procurement and supply, CSCP if you have not submitted yourself to a class, or CLTD. Join these great education. Okay, I think we're good for now, and if anyone wants to enable their sound, you can leave already, guys, because we have passed the time of the course. But if anyone wants to share their audios, just raise your hand to take an audio question from your side. Other than that, thank you very much for taking your time to listen, and stay safe, and keep yourself educated, actually. Abdul Ghani, Buras, let me try to unmute you. I'm trying to unmute you, Abdul Ghani. Just give me a second, please. No. This will take full audio control. Okay. So I unmuted everyone. If you have audio questions to me, please. Abed, if you want to ask a question. Dina?
Mr. Muhammad, I like you to tell me how to handle if we have only single supplier China, where we have imported all the production lines.
Okay. What can be done in this case? Yeah, for now, I think the exercise in the future, some companies today, manufacturers today, they shut down the entire manufacturing because their suppliers are in China. They understand this as a fact. But I think what the question is, what needs to be done going forward is just asking ourselves, is this the only source of supplies in the market? Where are we able to bring an alternative source of supply? Can this be done somewhere near my hometown? Remember the choices that we have today is thinking of shoring versus inshoring, sacrificing resilience for cost, which means less dependency on China as a manufacturer in the future or source of supply. But as I said in the start, I don't have a magical stick to a problem that you have today, because the current situation is messed up, actually. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Muhammad. God bless you and your family.
Thank you very much. Stay safe. Next. Noor.
Hello, Samer.
Hi, Noor.
يعطيك العافية at first. Samer, my question was, how can we, as you know, the automotive, we cannot have, let's say, ensuring as a solution, as we are depending on German suppliers, American suppliers, and Chinese suppliers. So this could be really to be self-dependent in this regard is really very critical.
Yeah.
What do you suggest in this regard? All our suppliers are affected with the epidemic.
No, the whole world is affected. Okay, we know this as a fact. So we don't have magical sticks, nor your company does. We know this, but at least how much am I dependent on my suppliers is something to reconsider in the future, Noor. Not today, but in the future, in the sense of
to go for, let's say, manufacturing cars in Jordan. This is the alternative.
Not necessarily, because this is something major, manufacturing is something major. But at least, how much stock do we hold out of an item? How fast we can get alternative suppliers in place? Can we rely on OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, as an alternative way? Is there a secondary market to bring our material from? Okay. Had there been any sources that we did not exploit out there in the world, in Mexico and whatever? Okay. These are the questions that should be considered in the future. Should we keep a warehouse in Jabal Ali, for example, for extra material to create resilient supply chains? This is costful. Yeah, there might be a cost for that, but that's the cost of resiliency instead of suffering the current situation. Okay, I think back to the same point, Noor. We need to think risk management going forward as a skill. Trying to anticipate what might happen and how much am I going to lose as a result of that. Then taking action to reduce this. Okay?
Okay, thank you so much, Samer.
Thank you, most welcome. Okay, I think that's it. Khaja, if you want to ask a question, please enable your sound system and ask it.
Mr. Muhammad, I like to tell you that after having all this certification, do you think that we will be able to create a risk, a risk assessment and all the actions which can really help us in the future to avoid completely the current scenario?
Okay, the scenario, the thing is not about having all these certificates. The thing is about the more educate yourself about the supply chain practices, the more you become able to judge and take actions. Okay, so regardless where you get that from, I don't really care. From books, reading about it, obtaining certificates, reading online resources, whatever it takes, man, to understand different practices that can help in this situation. Okay, so the market belongs today. If I want to hire a supply chain professional, I want to make sure they understand supply chain practices and they have risk management edge. So wherever you find that, go for it. But the thing is about the international certificates is that they have the proper structure of learning for supply chain. That's what I'm saying. Okay?
Very great, sir. Thank you so much, sir. God bless you and your family. You are really a great guy.
Thank you. Thank you. Most welcome, man. Thank you. Okay. We are far behind our schedule, and so I have a class to catch up with in 15 minutes. So I want to thank you all for attending, and I will make sure that you get a copy of these slides and probably a recording of that. Shukran lakum. Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, and we're looking forward always having you. And as long as we have time and we are locked in the houses, at least for me, make sure to have additional webinars like this. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. ويعطيكم ألف عافية.
Thank you, Samer.
Bye bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Samer.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Enjoy your time.
Salamat. Bye-bye.
Merci. Bye bye.